Welcome. We are Living Proof, experience as evidence in pain research, where people who live with pain get to ask the questions and guide the conversation instead of just answering the surveys. This podcast is brought to you by PEPR, the Partnership for the Engagement of People in Pain Research. The PEPR Partnership is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. I'm your host, Desmond Williams. I'm one of the co-directors of the PEPR Partnership. I sit on the Pain Canada National Advisory Committee, and I'm lucky to get to be on the steering committee of the Putting the Pieces Together conference for people with pain, by people with pain. I live with pain, I help people manage pain, and I'm proud to share my voice advocating for people that live with pain across Canada. And I'm joined by my co-host, Emerald Asuncion.
Hi, I'm Emerald, and throughout my last decade in community health and patient advocacy, chronic pain has had a constant presence in my work. And though it has been witnessed in me by others the whole time, it was only truly acknowledged by me when I made a commitment to decolonizing cultural practices as wellness practices, and finally, in just the last 2 years, medically affirmed with diagnoses. Today, I co-chair PEPR's Knowledge Mobilization and Empower Committees and work on PEPR's Community Consultations project as a research assistant. Welcome to Episode 2, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Decolonization. Why do we need an EDID lens in pain research? Meet us here at the critical intersection of healthcare and justice as we discuss why a long-term commitment to EDID principles is necessary to ensure that pain care moves beyond mere knowledge transfer towards fostering cultural shifts and holistically achieving change for everyone. There's a reason we titled this podcast Living Proof, Experience as Evidence, because the evidence is clear. Chronic pain is a major public health challenge, yet pain is often poorly recognized, assessed, and managed. For people who experience social inequities and structural violence, pain and related care are often reciprocally linked to experiences of injustice and stigma. This means that chronic pain must be viewed not only as a biomedical issue, but fundamentally as a social justice issue. Join us to dissect these systemic failures and co-create futures in community are two remarkable individuals.
We are pleased to introduce Mehmoona Moosa-Mitha, a key researcher whose work directly addresses the lack of engagement in research and exploring how to address inequities within healthcare responses. Her work in community advocacy focuses on how marginalized identities are shaped by coloniality and colonization. Through community-based participatory action research, she applies a decolonial lens to the study of trauma and pain, transnationality, social work, and citizenship. Mehmoona is a South Asian Muslim woman and settler on Coast Salish territory. Originally from Tanzania and deeply committed to amplifying voices and perspectives often overlooked in academic and healthcare contexts. Jenny Lorca is a Spoonie, storyteller, speaker, advocate, volunteer, and patient partner. She devotes her time and experience to building partnerships with organizations, initiatives, and projects such as Pain BC, Pain Canada, Chronic Pain Network, Canadian Arthritis Patient Alliance, Power Over Pain Portal, Circa Pain, the PEPR Project, and the University of British Columbia. Since 2022, Jenny has been a steering committee member for the Putting the Pieces Together conference for people with pain, by people with pain, and has contributed numerous powerful and moving presentations at pain conferences across Canada, from the Canadian Pain Society's annual scientific meeting and the Pacific Pain Forum. We highly encourage you to check the link in the description below and witness her creation, a powerful digital storytelling project on her relation to complex chronic disease, pain, and culture in her piece titled Masakit, Tagalog for It Hurts.
I just wanted to start with a smudge for all of us. Maybe take a moment, take an easy breath as we come together. And just share this space with each other. before we get into all sorts of conversation, just get to exist for a moment. So, welcome everybody. Welcome Emerald. Welcome Mehmoona. Welcome Jenny. Thank you for being here for our second episode of Living Proof, Experience as Evidence. And I'm really excited for this conversation. And so why don't I start by passing it off to Emerald to get all started.
I would like to invite you to give yourself an introduction to us. Tell us about your relationship to chronic pain or your work around it.
I can go first. I can see Mehmoona giving me the space energetically. My name is Jenny Lorca. I am a queer neurodivergent settler, a second generation Filipinx. My family immigrated here in the 60s, and my generation is my cousins in particular, and we were fully assimilated. And it's interesting that I'm sharing this in my introduction, especially as we're talking about who I am in relationship to chronic pain, because I think that pain isn't one of those things that is talked about. It's born, right? Like, can you bear it? And so that has been the undercurrent of a lot of things when I think about it, a lot. And I know I'm not alone in this, but for me, my chronic pain activation, I guess, started in 2019 when I was a registered nurse working in a hospice, and I suspected I had the beginnings of osteoarthritis. My mom already lived with rheumatoid arthritis. And so those things were already in the background. I didn't know anything about fibromyalgia at the time. I didn't know anything about chronic fatigue, which is also what I've got. Osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, chronic fatigue, or myalgic encephalomyelitis, and fibromyalgia. Did I say that already? But and that effectively cut my career as a nurse quite short. And as my friend Desmond Williams likes to say, pain is a catalyst for change. And that in my need to be of use, in my need to continue to contribute and to be a part of things and be productive, and I'm saying that in air quotes, and to just be in community, all of these mixed things, I ended up volunteering with Pain BC first as a health coach in their Coaching for Health program. Now, I'd learned about Pain BC when I was still a nursing student, and I went to a conference when they were in person in 2012 and listened to a couple of street nurses from the BC Centre for Disease Control talk about their experiences working with folks in the downtown east side, and how talking about the intersection of pain and poverty and comorbidities and just health and racism and traumatic stress and all of these things that I wasn't cognizant of, except that there were people hurting and people being left behind, and how their experiences were seen as something vastly different from anything textbook that I've read or experienced in clinical practice. But fast forward to 2019, where Pain BC once again comes up on my radar, but as a resource for myself, not as a clinician. And from there, I continued to get invited into things for whatever reason. And then in 2020, I became a peer support facilitator for their peer support and wellness groups, which was, well, it was kind of a 360 moment for me, because to go back to the downtown east side, I had been a volunteer there and learned about what true peer support really meant. So as an engaged person living with pain, and as a visible person living with pain, I was continued to be invited into things like Pain Canada's Putting the Pieces Together conference, where Desmond and I met. But we were sort of already on the peripheries of each other. We're like, yeah, that guy from Live Plan B Plus, and he and his mom are on the website. Oh, that guy, Desmond, that guy. And I have to credit Jen Hansen for bringing us together. She was the director of education and innovation at Pain BC at the time. And then what else? Pain Canada, I became a member, a patient partner in the Chronic Pain Network and getting involved in their community capacity building program, their committee, as well as most recently their EDID committee. And the Power Over Pain Portals Lived Advisory Committee and the Canadian Arthritis Patient Alliance and Circa Pain Research and a couple of other things that like other research projects that I'm a part of. And through it all, I continue to think of like, well, how is my role? How is my work, even though it's unpaid? And I know we'll talk about what work means later, but how is my work? How does that continue to evolve? How does that continue to emerge? How does that continue to inform how I live and breathe and move through the world, even as I continue to grieve what I left behind because of pain? So, I'm gonna stop there. I shared a lot.
That was awesome. I actually wanted to see if you could bring the thread back somehow with the acknowledgement of your culture. And I feel like the point was made in there because I understand what you're saying, because I was like, wow, relatable situation. If you could maybe try and describe it for people, how you see the connection of your culture and your chronic pain, and I guess in the context of your diversity, your inclusion. Yeah.
Oh, that's a really interesting question, Emerald, because I'm still trying to like, I think that over the last few years, I've been really trying to disentangle a lot of things like internalized white body supremacy, internalized racism, and the things that people don't realize are pain, but it's actually pain, right? In palliative care, we're taught or we learn what total pain means and how pain itself isn't just, and it has different names now, depending on which discipline you're in. The physical, it's the mental, the emotional, the spiritual, the relational, and then you look at systems, financial, bureaucratic. And when a community experiences pain, how does that impact the individual? Because that itself is deeply personal. To go into what our collective experience has been with respect to the Lapulapu Day Festival that happened earlier this year, where I was at home, I learned about the incident, and I knew that this festival was going on. But because I never felt like a real Filipino, to go back to the assimilation part, right? I felt like I had been, like I was called growing up, a coconut, brown on the outside, white on the inside. I felt like I didn't belong in those spaces. Whoa, crap. Woo. Um, so I didn't go. And at the same time, when I learned about what happened, when everyone started to check in with me and vice versa, when I reached out to family members that I don't talk to who were actually there, I experienced a huge pain flare, like couldn't get out of bed. I was so overwhelmed. Everything hurt. It hurt. It hurt to talk. It hurt to try and piece together what I was feeling. It hurt to be normal and walk around and pretend that. And I think that ties in with the invisibleness of so much. It ties in with the invisibleness of pain. It ties in with the invisibleness of microaggressions. It ties in with the invisibleness of all the shit pot stuff that I've internalized. I don't know if we're allowed to swear on this, but I just might. But it.
We're also allowed to cry on the podcast.
Thank you. Yeah. Oof. That's I mean, I'm unpacking it even now, right, Emerald? And I don't know if I have an answer. I won't. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a should thing. I should not have an answer. I think the answer, as one of my theater instructors says, is to live in the question, live in the question of what does this mean? What does this continue to mean? What what does it not just mean for me, but for my family and for my community? And what does my community look like? What does the collective look like? What does the world look like in relationship to all the invisibleness of pain? Yeah. I think I'm going to stop there. It get really big.
I don't even have any questions to follow up because you answered all of the ones I have within there. So why don't we pass it on to Mehmoona?
Jenny, thank you. That's a beautiful introduction. I have nothing like your introduction, so this is going to be the trend. So I got interested in researching pain. I don't live with chronic pain. I live with pain because I got interested as a South Asian Muslim woman who immigrated to Canada 50 years ago, but under duress because I was born in East Africa, and when Tanzania got independent, it decided that Asians were not Africans. So they got us to move in a forced way. And I knew about the trauma of that. And I was very interested in trauma work because of that, because of who I was. And I started researching trauma, and I was actually quite shocked because trauma was always talked about as it's something that happens in the third world country where they fight a lot and then they're pushed out and they have nowhere to go. And it's like this one event, and it's always about our backwardness, and that we come here and it's peaceful and this wonderful country where we are finally at peace. It just didn't resonate with my own experience, my community's experience. So I was already doing decolonial work in the academy on so many levels, but I started like taking on research projects, particularly with immigrants and refugees, to decolonize trauma and our understanding of trauma, but always as community-based participatory action, because I really had got tired of doing this research and then producing these papers and then they're shelved, right? Like, who reads them? I certainly don't read my own. So I started doing community work, and I always had been doing community work, but around trauma, and it led me to pain. It led me to this very intertwined phenomena of pain and trauma and how they coexist and how they are grounded in coloniality. And then I was invited by a research team initiated at UBC, and we had a cross partnership, and I joined that research team and began to do work around pain as it exists within refugee, immigrant, and indigenous communities, and began to see how misunderstood it is, particularly when listening to the lived experiences of people like what you were sharing, Jenny, and at every level, like what you were saying, Desmond, about entering a university, not being able to because you had pain and it was a barrier, and how we can stop that becoming a barrier. So there's a lot of things we do at the School of Social Work where I work, where we decolonize, and one of it is admission processes. And we include pain as a barrier to admission. And how can we do work with students that don't require them to have the same kind of demands on their body that's assumed to be normal, you know?
Thank you. Yeah, that's really amazing that you're capturing things from the structural level. And I'm wondering how you approach the challenges of recognizing the intersecting identities of people and having them included. How do you approach that?
So I approach it primarily through my understanding of colonization, which is, I mean, you are too young to remember Kimberly Crenshaw's work, but it was
I do.
during your time. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I wasn't there. I was like 9 years old. But
Yeah, exactly.
I've done
Yeah.
Black feminist work over the years, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I know she's famous, and all of us probably are familiar to her ideas. But, I was there. So for me, it was mind blowing, this intersectionality that we're not actually in uni identities that are separate and that we are not actually like that and that she voiced that. But when I did deeper work on colonization, I realized even more the wisdom of her argument, which is that we have multiple identities that talk to each other, impact each other in very deep ways. And what I realized was colonization itself is intersectional. It's as much about capitalism when a bunch of Europeans decided that they're going to go to the rest of the world and extract their resources. It was a capitalist endeavor. It's as much about race, what we call racial capitalism, right? It's very gendered colonization. It's very ableist, and I could go on. Like it is so deeply an intersectional phenomena. And one of its moves, one of its colonial moves, is to retain categorization that are separate and that are a barrier. Even divide and rule, like, colonials went, and this is why Asians like me were kicked out because we were not allowed to be in equal relationship with the indigenous Africans. Not allowed, literally, through British law. So I see it as deeply intersectional because I see colonization as deeply intersectional. And I'm every day amazed at yet another level by which this phenomena gets even more intertwined, by which we are both global and local and intersectional. And really, the whole point is to try and break those barriers to be able to see how it is that we are so deeply interconnected, like the Indigenous peoples of Canada say, right?
Yeah, very cool. Thank you. I guess I was thinking about the challenge being in that you're working with an institution and they have everything laid out and you are doing everything to prove them why their protocols and policies and processes need to change. And I was curious about the challenges in that. Yeah, you're standing up for a lot of people and their abilities to show up authentically and as themselves and in their goals and their desires to move forward and be a part of society. So, do you feel challenged from the institutions when you do this?
I feel challenged. I also don't feel alone. I'm no kind of hero in this work because I always do it with community and I'm led by community. But I do actually feel more and more, Emerald, that colonization hurts us all. See how narrow education becomes when it's colonial in nature because it's so into categorizing. Take the example of pain. Like to understand pain academically is to understand it only within a biomedical model. And how narrowing is that? And how much it hurts, say, even a person who is studying medicine at the university. It hurts their education. So I'm a firm believer that what the work I'm doing at the university in decolonizing the academy is actually necessary work, not for people like me only, who are people of color, or for us in this group, but for everyone in different ways. And there are different ways in which we get oppressed. So is it tough? Um, it's not tough when I think of decolonization within the structure as not having a magic bullet point, like this is what needs to happen and then everything will be all right. It took me many years and a lot of anger, a lot of tears to understand that in fact decolonization is a process and it's a failed project. I always tell my students it's a failed project because if we succeed, then we will do what the colonizers did, which is say, oh, this is universally true, but it's our truth, and you all have to accept it, and it's perfect. So those things really help me. But what helps me the most is, say, at the School of Social Work at UVic, We are a community of BIPOC scholars and allies, and we work so much with each other to do this work. So we are not othered as easily as it could be. It's $1 million question. Can you actually decolonize a colonial institution like a university? Audre Lorde thought not. You can't use the master's tools to bring down the master's house. But I, by nature, am a bridge builder, and I think there are possibilities. My students tell me every day there are evidence that there are possibilities to do and know differently. So there's a lot of frustration, and then there's also always a possibility of change.
Wow. I love this conversation. Thank you. Maybe I'll pass it on to Desmond. I know he has some questions too.
Well, just to follow up on what you just said, Mehmoona, that last thing that you said, where the idea of us maintaining certain aspects of hope in the process, because through the entire time of experiencing colonization, oppression, the many things on a day-to-day microaggressions that we deal with, it really does take away so much of your energy and your enthusiasm for certain things in certain spaces, and finding these things to anchor to and to look at, to find these little glimmers of hope really can make such a difference, especially in the experience where we integrate the understanding of trauma in the pain experience, because stress and trauma in certain spaces in trauma theory are on the same continuum, and the thing that separates or transitions stress into trauma is when hope or hopelessness is introduced. When you feel as though you can't do anything about that is when trauma becomes etched into our body, into our physical structure, which some may say manifests in different ways of pain. And so when we have that perspective, finding different ways that we can access hope and the idea that things can be different is really, really helpful, I think, for the people who may be watching who haven't found ways to engage with institutions in ways that feel as though it's not extractive or exploitative, and knowing that there are people who have been doing this work for a long time, slowly, steadily, always moving forward despite the many times we get pushed back, so that for the next generations, for the next 7 generations in certain spaces, when we talk about that, when we can heal those different traumas, we can work through the things that we pass down, so that the things that we pass down isn't just trauma. Because what you were saying, Jenny, about the certain assimilation of culture and certain things that we do to each other within culture, I truly believe that sometimes we carry forward these reactions to collective trauma as communities, and we hold on to these things as though they are our culture. You know, we speak to each other in this way, and we interact with each other within our families because that's how we just do that as our culture. But I really believe that that is a component of us carrying forward collective trauma and justifying it in the way that we speak to ourselves, the way that we speak to others who look like us, when it really is a manifestation of our inability to work through those cultural traumas and deal with the grief that we deal with that is ever evolving. Because, Jenny, you were talking about the recovery from what happened this year and how it's still a process that you're dealing with. And that's the thing when we're dealing with pain, when we're dealing with grief, when we're dealing with stress, that it isn't something that we're looking for some sort of finish line. It's a journey. It's a process, just like the process of decolonizing the work that we do, where, Mehmoona, it's not an end game where, like, okay, we won.
Yeah.
Hooray, like we
That
have
would be nice.
successfully, no more
Decolonize.
colonization, because yeah, then we are turning it around and finding justification to oppress somebody because of something else. And the only way that we can successfully find ways to navigate these systems is to find ways to help people understand that this is not a process that is going to be taking away your rights as a person who maybe doesn't deal with certain intersections of oppression, and that institutionally there will be benefits to this idea that with EDI hires that you're getting hired because of something,
Yeah.
as opposed to no, this means that we're actually looking at the right people with the qualifications, as opposed to like eliminating certain names on resumes because they don't fit with what we would like, or it doesn't remind me of me. And so it really is a slow and steady process that we're working through. I really appreciate all of the directions that this conversation has gone already. It's such a rich group of topics: equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. And it really is a fully intersectional experience for everybody, where there's many things that we relate to, that we come together on, many things that we have these unique experiences that we can learn from each other and really start to grasp the full depth of how these systems are affecting all of us in similar ways and in these really unique ways as well. I'm just so grateful that we get to have this space together, have this time together. I really think that it's amazing how in just our introductions we got into so much, because that was really just in talking about what it is we do and why we do it. I also just want to take a moment to highlight the many different groups that Jenny mentioned that she is involved with in advocacy, and for people who do live with pain, who feel as though they are alone or are struggling to find connection and community or solidarity, that there are so many interesting spaces out there that are already starting to hold space for our different identities and the way that we bring our full selves into these groups, instead of just being like, we're in a pain group and I just have to talk about my pain, because it's so much more than that when it comes to addressing how we amplify the voices and how we carry this dialogue forward. So I think, to carry on from what Mehmoona you had said about that idea of there's no solution to this. And I feel like that brings up an interesting idea of a certain perspective that we bring in this work sometimes, of certain levels of unconscious bias. The way that we think that the way that we do it is always going to be the right way, and certain aspects of that. And I'm curious, just before we get too deep into that, if maybe you could share your perspective of maybe what a definition of what unconscious bias is in relation to this work.
Jenny was so brilliant. I was like, Jenny.
No, go,
Okay.
Mehmoona.
Okay, I'm like really getting into this now. So, can I contextualize unconscious bias within the health system? Because we're talking about that engagement in PEPR. Because we could talk about unconscious bias forever otherwise. So I'm just going to do that, and then Jenny maybe will do much, much more. um, there are so many ways by which the health system enacts practices of coloniality, of which unconscious or so-called unconscious bias, I think, is primary. The obvious ways are that they assume the body to be neutral. They say, oh, we are scientists, all healthcare professionals. We are scientists, we see a body, we're concerned with where is the pain located in this body. When in fact, we know through studies, which this group here doesn't need studies to know this, there is always the reading of bodies that occurs, called colonization. There is always the white superior gaze, or the gaze of the doctor, who is examining the body and making judgments about that body, cultural judgments. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to uncover what this unconscious bias looks like in what people have told me it has looked like in their engagement with the healthcare system. So there is the thing that of this scientific neutrality, which in fact doesn't exist. And we have studies that show that Black people and Indigenous people and women are 10 times more likely, if not more, to be disbelieved, underassessed, ridiculed, etc., when engaging with a healthcare professional around their pain. Their embodied knowledge of pain is seen as irrelevant. And that is a bias. And the other bias is that within the scientific Western colonial ways of knowing, there's a body mind binary, Cartesian binary, it's called. The mind is where knowledge resides in this system, right? The body has no knowledge. And so the doctor will say, where are you feeling pain? You know, one of my refugee participants told me, a woman in a hijab, so already the stakes are high, goes into, sees the doctor, has been going to the same doctor for 2 years. Doctor, I feel pain on the right side of my head. And the doctor says, it's nothing, take some Tylenol, this back and forth until finally she goes and says, I'm blacking out. And actually shows the entire part of her head where she's feeling the pain. The doctor. So then this time the husband is accompanied this woman and says, we're not leaving until you do a test on her. And inevitably the test is done and she has a tumor, which has grown exponentially over the last 2 years. But she's unheard and disbelieved because of bias. And it's two kinds. They're reading the body as inferior, and you couldn't possibly know because you're just a woman in hijab who doesn't speak English very well. And secondly, because I'm the scientist and I've got the mental, intellectual knowledge. And who are you? You just have embodied knowledge. And what is that? The body doesn't know anything. And we know from colonization, the body is the target of colonial violence actually has a lot of knowledge, very familiar with what colonization means and does to the body. It's just no one wants to listen to it. So that's the other form of unconscious bias. Why it's called unconscious, I don't know. So I have a hard time with that, but they call it unconscious, right? Normatively, it's called unconscious. We didn't know that the body actually, we use stereotypes to understand and read the body. But the last one, and I'll be quick because I really want to hear what Jenny has to say. Because you've been nodding so vigorously. I'm like, oh yeah. Is this bias that is really shocking to me. So colonization had so many theories about why we were inferior, scientific theories. Health systems were integral in not just complicity, but propagation of colonization. The hospital, the Indian hospital was a site where indigenous people were either punished by being called mad or sick or whatever and put into hospitals when they were resisting colonization. But even worse, they were treated, and this is not just in indigenous people in Canada, colonization everywhere in the world used health centers as sites to experiment on the bodies of indigenous peoples around the world, as though they were objects of scientific experimentation. So there is a huge complicity. But what's really sad for me is that that continues today. And what studies have shown, and for this I did need studies because I couldn't believe it, that if you want to call it bias, that falsity, that we are somehow, our bodies are inferior, our minds are inferior because we have a certain physical appearance continues to this day. And it is called unconscious bias, but the health practitioners were asked about their unconscious bias, and they said it's not a bias, it is a fact that different races have different bodies and that the skull size of these black people or brown people is smaller than white people. So they're actually, it's not us, it's a scientific fact that they are actually inferior. And the idea that difference equals inferiority is a continuity from those colonial, direct colonization days. And so I don't see unconscious bias as either unconscious or discontinuous. It's not an anomaly. It's not like a matter of let's teach them actually that they're wrong. It's actually very, very deeply ingrained historically.
Right.
Anyway, I could go on.
I love that you acknowledged it as like, how can it be unconscious when also earlier you acknowledged that in this colonized world, we love categorizing people and putting them into boxes. So you're
Exactly.
very conscious where you put those people and why they're in that box. Yeah.
I'm not surprised that so much of health disciplines are siloed from each other
Yeah.
because of those things, right? I was talking with a bunch of new physiotherapy students who are just learning how to do their assessment, their subjective assessment. And I couldn't stop talking about systems. And one of those things was like, I said, I made a comment on how physiotherapy is like many allied health and para health professions are isolated from each other in practice. So if I were in a car accident and I am currently seeing a kinesiologist, a massage therapist, an acupuncturist, a counseling therapist, and a chiropractor, and thankfully, 3 of those practitioners work in the same clinic so they can talk about it. But the thing is, it puts the onus on me to communicate with each one of those healthcare professionals to be like, okay, well, my kinesiologist says this, my chiropractor says this, and my acupuncturist says this, and then I have to process it all with my therapist, right? So it's yes, yes to the categorization, yes to the it's not as unconscious as we think it is. It made me think of Mehmoona. There's one content creator on Instagram. His name is Khalil Green, and he brought up something about the incentives barometer as an example of racism embedded in the medical system, which was basically taking that theory of Black people's skulls are smaller, but then their lung capacity is smaller, therefore they can't do these things. And that theory was taken down to somebody who invented the spirometer, which basically measures lung capacity when you breathe into it, but made adjustments and calibrations for white people, Black people, Asian people. So similarly, and women, white, people who are Black, Asian, Indigenous, women were getting underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed with respect to lung disease. So yeah, absolutely. There's so much out there that I am learning to discover in horror. And interestingly enough, like as a part of calling myself in, I felt like I had to do homework for this podcast, right? And I was really sitting with like, we're talking about the purpose of this of gathering together is to talk about our lived experiences. Lived experience is evidence. So why am I doing research on something to try to prove myself because I have imposter syndrome, because I don't think I'm enough, because my embodied knowledge isn't enough, my existence isn't enough. So I'm, again, trying to unpack and untangle and just call it for what it is, right? Like, why am I trying to make myself not myself? Why am I trying to show up as not myself? So thank you for this space for me to be my goofy, neurodivergent, tree branch conversation self and the emotional self too.
I'm just gonna.
And I just want to say as well, from that and from what Mehmoona had said as well, this idea of unconscious bias and the unconscious idea in the realm of institutions and how we work with the language of the intellect, and how having this phrase unconscious bias allows people to almost justify a particular treatment because, oh, well, it's an unconscious bias. It wasn't something that was built into the technology, right, Jenny? About the lung capacity testing, that like it was built into the technology, that these differences for race and everything. And so the doctors who were testing didn't even know that they were getting different results for different patients because it was built in, because the scientists proved that black people have different lung capacity, and so we don't have to test for that. And the fact that they die at a much higher percentage of lung disease and other things that are related to those, that doesn't have anything to do with the fact that we have different allowable levels of healthy capacity for them. Totally unconscious. We justify it in that way. And I feel like that is one of the reasons why it's so important to have these conversations about the structural and institutional ways that this has been incorporated into the fabric of what we're dealing with, as opposed to something that just like, oopsie, happened and here we are, and we have to find better ways to deal with it. Because yeah, having the term unconscious bias is a way that we can justify that this happens all the time, and it's just something that we just thoughtlessly do. Whoops. I feel like that is a really great segue for our next thing that we were hoping to talk about. And so I just want to pass it back over to Emerald as we move on to our next
Sure.
topic for inclusive language.